I'm Cornell Clayton, director of the Foley Institute, and on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out today. This is our latest in our series on the future of liberal democracy. And I'll just note that we have two more events the remainder of this semester. One is next week, talk on access to healthcare. That's not part of this series. But our final event is on December 3rd. It's with Michael McFaul, former ambassador to Russia, now at Stanford. And he's going to be talking about his new book, Democrats and Authoritarians. So today, however, we have with us, I'm very excited. Those of you who were here with Mac McManus 2 weeks ago heard a lot about our guest today, Samuel Moyn, who's the Kent Professor of Law and History at Yale University, where he also serves as the head of Grace Hopper College. He is a prolific author. His work has appeared in the leading academic journals of political thought and history, as well as more popular outlets such as The Atlantic, Dissent, The Guardian, the London Review of Books, Nation, The New Republic, New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, Washington Post. I could go on and on. Professor Moyn spent more than a decade writing major books about the history of human rights and international law, including The Last Utopia, Human Rights and History, published by Harvard University Press. Not Enough, Human Rights in an Unequal World, also published by Harvard University Press. Christian Human Rights, published by University of Pennsylvania. And Humane, How the U.S. Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War, which was published in 1921. Or, sorry, 1920, in 2021. Not that old.
It's ancient history,
He has a forthcoming book, speaking of old, he has a forthcoming book entitled Gerontocracy in America, How the Old Hoard Power and Wealth. And I know some of our students are interested in that talk. Prior to that book, or this forthcoming book, however, his most recent book and the subject of today's talk is entitled Liberalism Against Itself, Cold War Intellectuals and the Making of Our Times, which was published by Yale University Press 2 years ago. Join me now in welcoming Sam Moyn.
Okay, well, thanks to Cornell for the intro, and thanks above all to Richard for organizing all of this. This is an extraordinary series, and it's just a privilege to be part of it. You've had folks come through this room who are some of the main players in a debate that has been, pretty intense since about 2016. And that's the year, famously, in which people who call themselves liberal, of whatever description, across the Atlantic, have been freaking out. And that's because they were blindsided by unexpected events that caused them to worry. The first, of course, was the Brexit vote in the United Kingdom. And then later that year, there was the first, but not last election of Donald Trump to our country's presidency. And right away, the term liberalism, which, who knows what it means, hopefully we'll get more headway as this talk goes on, got memeified. And Edward Luce, a Financial Times journalist, wrote a book in response to the Brexit vote saying, this is about the death of liberalism. And then a couple of years later, someone who spoke earlier in this series, a reactionary Roman Catholic political theorist named Patrick Deneen, scored an enormous bestseller when he published Why Liberalism Failed, as if the record was already clear that, it was time maybe to mourn, but the corpse was cold. And no less prominent a liberal than Barack Obama himself praised Deneen for forcing liberals to think about what went wrong in their movement, whatever it stood for. And so really since then, there's been a debate connecting current events with something called liberalism and its fate. And this series is amazing because it puts you really in the thick of hearing about different positions in that debate, and I'll basically give you mine. It's not died down. The second campaign, or third, sorry, of Donald Trump and either second or third victory, depending on what you think happened in 2020 last year, led to people singing a different tune. It's funny, in the old days, in the Cold War, among the Cold War liberals, I'll talk about later in this lecture, they like to say, well, there was never anything in this country but liberalism. There was never an old regime here. And so Americans just are liberal by default. But after Trump, it became popular to say, no, there's a deep illiberalism in this country's history, and Donald Trump is just part of it. So that's a change. Having been blindsided in 2016, by 2024, a lot of liberals weren't sure whether they had ever had the upper hand in this country or anywhere. And of course, you've had Stephen Hahn here too, saying, no, actually, America has this deep illiberal thing. And there are many others who've made of that case. Today, just last week, the liberal columnist and podcaster for the New York Times, Ezra Klein, he's a distinctive liberal himself. He is a so-called abundance bro. We can get into that in the Q&A if you want. He wrote, this is literally from last Sunday. He said, since 2024, I've found myself obsessively reading histories of liberalism, looking for something, even though I wasn't sure exactly what. And, anyway, I've been doing the same reading for a bit longer, and I'm going to report on what I came up with in response to this debate, which is really interesting. And I'm not totally sure still what it's about, but I'll tell you what I think some of the terms of the debate have been. And then we can decide, well, should we have that debate? Is it useful? If we're having it, what position should we take? So roughly, I'll talk for a little bit about the form of the debate over liberalism, roughly in the first Trump administration from 2016 to 2020. And then I'll step back and say, well, what if we did the reading earlier than Ezra Klein and read the books about liberalism that are all in the library and have been for years in some case? How would what the professionals, historians of political thought know about liberalism bear on this memeified debate? And then I'll tell you my own view, which is that liberalism, at least in some respects, is an emancipatory doctrine that ought to be reclaimed from the liberals of the 20th century. And that might be our best choice in this debate and even now, although it gets contentious, and I don't want to be too political because we all have a right to our own views, and we should debate those at the end. Okay, so Deneen published his book, and many people responded. New Yorker columnist Adam Gopnik was one, but the truth is he was just representative of a crew of people who wrote like 1,000 books in response to Deneen. And when I looked at these books, which all came out roughly in 2018, 19, 20, I was struck by how similar they all were, even when they purported to be disagreeing. Here's why. They all kind of agreed about what liberalism is or was, and just had let's say a petty disagreement over whether to celebrate or reject it. Here's what Deneen said. Liberalism is about 500 years old. It's born in the aftermath of the Renaissance and Reformation. One of its founders, if not Thomas Hobbes, is John Locke. And so that puts it, like as a theory and a movement, kind of in Europe, but especially Anglophone Europe, long before our time, long before the 19th and 20th centuries. And Deneen, as a Roman Catholic, kind of nostalgic for the Middle Ages and Thomistic thought, and the alleged community that obtained kind of before the church was ruptured by the Reformation, thought liberalism was kind of like what modernity is like. It's about unbridled individualism and relativism. Individuals got emancipated, they could do what they like, they could think what they like, they could live, not just lives of liberty, but license and sin. And they then live lives that are alienated from one another because they are, just on their own in a kind of desert of narcissism or selfishness. Now, these respondents, Gopnik, others, basically agreed with all that. They also insisted that liberalism is old. It's mainly Anglophone, with Locke as its founder. Its basic point is individualism, freedom against the state above all, and the oppression that the state could impose. It's just that these respondents, Gopnik and all the others, think that that's all good. They don't think it's relativistic. They think that we are on our own and ought to be on our own, living freedom and private life above all. Whatever choices we make, that's on us. And so if there's a loss of community, that's a good thing because community is just oppressive. The main issue that they single out is that kings and states, especially democratic states, could also be tyrannical. And liberalism stood for individuals against the tyranny of government. And they just couldn't understand why people would long for more order and authority like Deneen. They also couldn't understand, since they all mostly lived on the East Coast, why anyone would vote for Donald Trump, why anyone would think to reject liberalism. And so their response to our time was to say, well, we should just rally around it. Write some press releases about how good it is in hopes that the wayward voters of our time will see the light. So that was the structure of the debate as I saw it. And I found it just to be out of step on both sides with what we actually knew about the history of liberalism if we cared to do the reading. Because I don't think Deneen really did, and I definitely don't think many of these publicists who just rose in defense of liberalism had taken care to kind of at least read beyond John Locke. So actually, it's an amazing era academically in the study of what liberalism is and has been. And I've just put on the slide some of the monuments of what actual scholars have been saying long before Donald Trump was doing anything other than reality television about liberalism. I'm not going to get into the details since time is lacking, but I'll just mention two scholars whom I recommend. One is University of Cambridge Don named Duncan Bell. And he wrote this essay in the journal Political Theory and said, here's something interesting. John Locke was never considered a liberal until the 20th century. He was retroactively made the founder of liberalism under particular circumstances. And that doesn't mean that there weren't antecedents to liberalism. If we want to understand what it is and was, one promising approach could be to find out, well, who actually called themselves liberals, who used the word liberalism. And we know basically that that only happens in the 19th century. Now, if that's true, we at least are entitled to an explanation of how something that is supposedly 500 years old actually is much newer. And if we're interested in the history, we might get interested in what the actual self-described liberals thought they were for, said they were for. Helena Rosenblatt, who's the author of A Lost History of Liberalism, she's like the one person I would have included in this series. Ask me, but it's an amazing series, but I would.
I wanted to.
She has shown that the first liberals to call themselves that starting in the 1820s, after the French Revolution, were not Anglophones. They were French and German. Actually, the first one was a Spaniard. And she says, when you look at them, we find something, I think, surprising. These are folks who don't believe that the state is the problem. That's not their main idea. Liberty, especially for property, against the state and its depredations. That was Locke's problem, for sure. But when we look at the founding liberals, and they have names like Constant and Mill and Tocqueville, they all have somewhat different views. They think that liberalism is going to be like a replacement for all the old belief systems of the ancient world and the medieval world. But it's going to be like them in offering a new way of life for all of us. So far from being relativistic, it's a new moral teaching. And it comes about when it does in the 1800s because its real inspiration is the French Revolution, which happened in France in the late 18th century. And that's, I assume, why Richard, whoever did the poster for this talk, has this very famous painting called Liberty Leading the People, which is about the French Revolution, like on the poster. That's Rosenblatt's view, is that we, okay, Cornell, credit where it's due, props. So like her idea is that liberalism is emancipatory and it's about using the state to emancipate us. So it might be about individual freedom, but it's about a new collective project in the name of individual freedom and collective freedom as a goal. And so I was inspired by that to ask, well, what if we, like Ezra Klein, did the reading and then tried to kind of comment on this debate about Trump and his fans and critics. Well, so what I did was to tell a very simple story about liberalism that starts in the 19th century when Rosenblatt insists that we start, and then continues into the 20th century. And so very simply, it has two parts. There's liberalism 1.0 and liberalism 2.0. And when we look at those original authors, Constant, Mill, Tocqueville, and so that's what liberalism was. We're then in position to ask, well, what happened to it when it was updated in the 20th century? So just to be very general, what I concluded is that, while liberalism was very close, not just in our own time, but in its founding era to laissez-faire economics, it kind of thought that would be the road for emancipation into the future. Its views were, I think, very different than what its current critics and fans say. First, it was perfectionist, meaning that liberals said, we're replacing religion with a new faith, which is going to be like everyone gets the chance and gets help from the state to live an interesting life on their own terms. And they might do that in community. They might need other people to band together because most of our great interesting art is not done by individuals. Leonardo da Vinci had a whole crew, and you might need a group in order to do a collective artwork. And so it's not against community, but it is for creativity. So it's not relativistic, as either the critics or the fans of liberalism in our day have said. It also said that emancipation, like Rome, doesn't get built in a day. And so we have to think of it as a long-term project, like we're part of an intergenerational struggle for emancipation, because it's not just about like waking up and realizing that you have a chance to be free. You need to be made free and you need the right institutions. so that you can live a life of freedom, most notably including educational institutions like this one. But those have to be built, they have to be designed properly. All the institutions of government and society have to be. And the question is, can we see our history over these kind of an intergenerational span of years as something that's progressive? So they believed, these liberals, that we could. And we had to. That doesn't mean there wouldn't be setbacks, there wouldn't be scary things, but fear wasn't at the center of their emotions. Hope was, because they thought we had to see ourselves as part of some big thing, which was freedom coming online for the species. Over the later 19th century, these liberals invented something called the new liberalism. Americans called it progressivism because one of the most amazing facts we've learned is that there were no self-described liberals in this country, basically until the New Republic magazine was founded after World War I. And all of those new liberals, progressives in this country, learned from Marxism. Matt McManus might have talked about this, and I won't, just repeat what he said, but they basically said, well, wait, if laissez-faire economics creates new hierarchies, then we need to think differently about the economy. And we need to invent liberal socialism or the liberal welfare state, because we can't just let those hierarchies subordinate people. And so liberals of the kind I'm talking about, they're basically paving the way for Franklin Roosevelt in our country, kept the freedom part, but they abandoned laissez-faire in the name of a state that would have some role in emancipating us. Okay, real quick, because it's the one book you might have read in one of your classes here, John Stuart Mill. He's a charter member of Liberalism 1.0. He says, our goal in life is to be interesting. That's why we're here. The point of liberalism is to help us, to tell us to be interesting and to organize society and the state to let us try. And that will allow a lot of collective benefits for not just, some people, but everyone. Now, he's generally taught, because of the same Cold War that made Locke the founding father of liberalism, as a libertarian. He's not as concerned about property as Locke was, but Mill is routinely taught as the theorist of free speech, which he was. But you can't read the book and miss that his whole point is we have free speech not as a right, but as a means to an end of having a chance to be interesting. Okay, so Liberalism 2.0 ruined everything as I see it. And we can get into detail, but I finger some of these folks writing in the middle of the 20th century who are known as Cold War liberals. And my basic thesis is that these people betrayed liberalism in the name of saving it and set us up for our own time, including the kind of mistaken debate about liberalism that we've been having. The most famous bro here is Isaiah Berlin, who's another English thinker, but they're all significant, and I don't want to get into detail. What do these people do? Well, they make Locke credibly the founder of liberalism because they say the point of liberalism is liberty from interference. Individuals should basically be left alone, especially by the state, and that's the point of liberalism. It's funny, but Berlin actually was a social democrat when he voted, but he never said anything about that. And his theory of liberalism as liberty as non-interference is kind of like a good argument for not letting the state tax us. And so I argue that he was kind of unwittingly advancing the neoliberal cause. I just mentioned that because I know you've had a talk by Gary Gerstle about neoliberalism. Other of these Cold War liberals said, we shouldn't think history as emancipatory. That's what the Soviets say, which is true. And we should just abandon our claims to think that the arc of the moral universe is long, but ends in freedom. And so I think the trouble is that that view makes history, that kind of collective emancipation of which we could be part over generations, seem almost meaningless. There's just us in our private lives choosing what we want. We're not part of something bigger. And so I think that was sad. And there are other elements to Cold War liberalism. I think it's been something that has endured, not least in this country, even after the Cold War, because liberalism got defined in this era as basically libertarian, giving little purpose to the state, casting emancipation as dangerous. Even after there was no Soviet Union falsely claiming to be an emancipation project for humanity. I think worst of all, these Cold War liberals abandoned hope. Franklin Roosevelt, just before the Cold War, had never done that. His whole point was to think of us all in it together, with the state having a crucial role in making us not just free from want, but free in all the other ways we're entitled to be. Roosevelt famously rejected fear as the basis of our politics, but one of the most famous Cold War liberals, Judith Shklar is her name, she was a Harvard professor, said, liberals should start with fear, because here's the truth about our lives. The worst thing that can happen to us is pain, especially state-inflicted pain. And we should just organize liberalism to keep it from happening to the extent that's possible. And she called her politics the liberalism of fear. Now, I think we should be fair to these people. They lived through a time when the state was predatory, especially the totalitarian state. But the question is, what's the alternative? What should the state be doing for us in our name to make us free, assuming that's just not automatic? And I think it's here that the Cold War liberals lost the plot. They might even have made more sense in their time. The trouble is, after the Cold War, their ideas were so hegemonic, so powerful in so many places that we were left without any good memories of what liberalism was for. Okay, so I'm going to conclude with some thoughts about the present and where we stand. And it's going to get a little edgy because you have to, in this moment, think about, well, how does all this, mumbo jumbo about history and theory relate to our time? So we have to first ask, why is it that Americans voted for Trump not once, but twice, maybe 3 times, depending on your view of 2020? Take no stand on that one. Well, that's been the central debate of the past 9 years now. It's amazing to think that the age of Trump is now 9 years old, and obviously will continue. I think there are a lot of reasons. I won't, kind of beat the dead horse of neoliberalism in this series because I think other speakers have addressed it. But I think it's true that the neoliberal economics that got started in the 1970s have left people in an economic position to be very skeptical of liberals. Now, there's a fair question about why they're voting for conservatives, because they've been even more neoliberal. Ronald Reagan, even Donald Trump, whose main legislative accomplishment as of today is a tax cut that was recently renewed in the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill. And so it's just puzzling if you think that a kind of neoliberal state that's mainly interested in taking less of your money and giving you less of a good life because it doesn't have the means to do otherwise, is why that position would gain a lot of support for the right is a super interesting question. But my trouble, and I think Matt McManus's trouble and that of many others on the left, is that the trouble is that the liberals became so neoliberal in this same era. Bill Clinton ending the welfare state as we know it. Barack Obama letting financial crisis destroy the lives of millions only to bail out the rich, and so forth and so on. Even Joe Biden, we could debate, well, how much did he abandon the standard economic program of the Democrats of the past 50 years? But in this context, I think it's wrong to just focus on economics because that would miss the point of what liberalism was in its first era and the way it changed so much in its second era, even if that did set up some neoliberal outcomes. Because I also think that people have been voting for Trump as a protest against elites who have not just made massive mistakes, military and otherwise, but have also given Americans little sense that the future is bright for them. You and I all remember, even the young students here who were probably children in 2016, but still were around, that Donald Trump came out and said, I was elected to do something about American carnage. And the chattering classes thought, you can't do this. You can't tell the truth about what's happened to this country. You always have to talk as if it's great and it's getting better. And they predicted that Trump would be a flash in the pan. Well, guess what? It hasn't happened. And I think that's because millions and millions of people, 70 odd million in 2016, 80 odd million in 2024, have not credibly believed that Trump could bring back American hope. It'd be crazy to think so, based on the policies he's implemented. We can debate that if you want, very happy to. But they have wanted to protest the mainstream forces in both political parties. They let Trump take over one and they let him beat the other because they wanted to punish the politicians and programs that led them to think that their children and grandchildren won't have a brighter future and better life than they've had. That was always what Americans thought was their birthright, and it's disappeared in our time. And so to me, what's significant is that Trump is a strange messenger for a call I want to make, which is on the left, to return to the sources of liberalism against what happened to it in the 20th century. If we took that call seriously, we would need to, in a sense, go back to the future. Not that there's some liberalism in Mill or Tocqueville or whatever thinker you like that we would just, reboot because there are all kinds of problems in their thought. But there's some premises, some planks in liberalism 1.0 that we desperately need now. One is hope, a philosophy that says you can be free. The state and politics can play a role in helping you get there. And I love Roosevelt, not just because he said we shouldn't place fear at the center, but because he indicted all those liberals like Gopnik and all the rest who have in our time said we should just restore things as they were before Trump. And Roosevelt's answer to that was decisive. Don't talk about #saving democracy unless you mean the real version of it to which we're entitled and not the false version that has failed too many people. 2 days ago or whenever it was that Zoran Mamdani won the mayoralty in New York, I think he gave a shout out to this kind of Rooseveltian thought when he says, we have to believe in emancipation as something that is a real promise, a future that will be better than our past. We've lost even the ability to conceive such a thing. Politicians aren't promising it, so he's doing so. But then the question is what the details are. And I hope that the debate about what liberalism was and is, once we get past the falsehoods of Deneen and his interlocutors about that topic, will lead us to return to like the true kind of plan of the early liberals, which was institutional. Like, how beyond schooling do we design a society that avoids oppression, for sure, but also finds the right mix of institutions, governmental and non-governmental, to make us free and give us the chance at interesting lives. And so I hope that in the end, this period, not just of the debate around liberalism, but liberalism on the brink in the United States and elsewhere, will lead us to its renewal. But that will be up to you. So I'll stop there and take whatever questions.
Okay, we have about 20 minutes for some Q&A. Maybe I'll start us off then.
Okay, sure.
Okay. So I'm interested, your argument is that the Cold War liberals, thinkers, ruined liberalism. But there's certainly some strands, and it ruined liberalism because it led to neoliberalism, basically. It seems to me was what you're saying. But there are certainly strands in those thinkers that led to, or could have led to, a very different tradition, in fact did, in terms of political theory. So Isaiah Berlin talks a lot about pluralism and toleration, why that's so important for living the best life.
Sure.
And that aspirational form of liberalism is picked up in thinkers like John Rawls and Ron Dworkin and others later.
Sure.
So why is it that strand coming out of Cold War thinking didn't take off and neoliberalism did?
Yeah. So there's a little bit of an intricate answer, because it's not like I'm arguing that the main goal of Cold War liberals, or even the main effect of their thought, was to pave the way for neoliberalism. I think that's true, but it's not the main reason that I think they were on the wrong track. Instead of getting into the details of like that argument about neoliberalism, I think it's better to just talk directly about kind of Berlin and Rawls, because it's true Berlin was a pluralist and the later Rawls was. But if that's your view, you're kind of saying, you're agreeing with Deneen that liberals shouldn't have an account of the good life. Berlin's idea was sort of that we just couldn't come to agreement about that, maybe without a state imposing such a vision. And Rawls was completely open in his later thought in political liberalism, which is much more Berlinian than his earlier thought in a theory of justice, that we should reject Mill and the other so-called comprehensive liberals in the name of a tolerationist doctrine. Now note that if you're a perfectionist, because that's in the jargon of the field, these are the two positions, perfectionism and tolerationism. If you're a perfectionist, you make room for, live and let live, because the whole point of your perfectionist theory is that everyone gets to go their own way. But of course, that has to be a program that's publicly accepted. You don't get to disagree with it. You might, have your schools teaching you things you don't want, because the state's job is to make you free. And so it's just not right to say that the kind of liberal pluralist approach was its own like uplifting view. It was the Cold War liberal view, and I think it was a mistake. And so I'm kind of saying we need to go back before that mistake. Now, there's another argument that I've heard and people often make, which is that other Cold War liberals, in part because they understood on a global stage how powerful communism was and its promise of emancipation, did things like invent the welfare state and even allow for decolonization on a global scale because there was a struggle for hearts and minds. The Great Society, which we briefly had under Lyndon Johnson in our country, has to be understood like the Civil Rights Revolution as a response to the Cold War. And so many people have argued that it's exactly in the Cold War that liberals finally got ambitious. I mean, there's some truth to that, clearly, but it's not because they were pluralist, it's because they were scared of the communists. So my view is we should look back for the like ambitious sources of liberalism to the 19th century. But I don't know if you want to pursue this, but I'd have to understand why you think pluralism is uplifting. For me, it's like saying, well, what kind of pluralism? Of course, there's a reasonable pluralism that's about people getting to pursue their own lives in their own way. But if that's a warrant for saying the state has no role in launching us into our free lives, then it's a terrible mistake.
Well, I was later, but yeah. So I mean, because Berlin does draw on Mill in making his argument for pluralism that it is part of seeking your own best life.
Yes.
We have to allow people to do that.
Sure. Oh, so
So
no
that's
debate about
sort
that.
of a perfectionist.
Yeah, the point about liberalism is you're getting to pursue your best life, but then there are deep questions like, what if you don't want to? What if you're not prepared to? What if you're not educated to? What if you want to throw your freedom away? And there, Berlin has no theory of an emancipatory politics or state, and so like those who I think have thought more deeply about kind of going your own way, including Mill himself, whom Berlin's very nervous about in his essay, John Stuart Mill and the Ends of Life. They've thought, well, we need to find the balance between a politics that's about launching you and one that, tolerates you some of what you do, but not all. Because what about all of the, if you are throwing your freedom away or you're not interested in it, so there are very intricate debates to have there, and I just worry that Berlin kind of reached the wrong answers on those questions. Yes, go ahead.
You want to go first? Okay. Thanks, Olivia. Matt McManus made the observation that one of liberalism's biggest downfalls is it doesn't have a theory of power. Do you have any observations or responses to that?
Sure.
Especially in comparison to this kind of revival of a pre-Cold War liberalism.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it's wrong. I mean, we'd have to know what is a theory of power such that liberals lack it. I think it might be true that some liberals today lack a theory of how they can win in the struggle in American politics, just because they just lose so often. I'm not the other day though, but I would have to get clearer from Matt, what it would mean to have a theory of power, because we had Machiavelli all those centuries ago, and no one didn't know that you need to struggle and be tactically savvy to advance your goals. I don't think these early liberals didn't have a plan. Sometimes it was the wrong plan because they were all empire builders. I didn't have time to mention that, but that's something we definitely need to edit out. But my problem is something that happens within liberalism about not how you struggle, but what you're struggling for. Because liberals don't all agree about that, and that's the essence to me. that we need to first have that debate before we figure out, well, how do you build power and achieve, the wherewithal to advance the plan?
Okay, I've got a question from one of our online viewers. It's our colleague Paul Thiers, who is interested to hear your thoughts about the white supremacist backlash against civil rights and the expansion of the welfare state since 1980, particularly around who gets to pursue their best life.
So there certainly was a backlash against the civil rights movement, but the rise of Donald Trump, I don't think is mainly about that backlash. And we know that because if we just track who abandons the Democratic Party and when, it's just too late to explain that. I'm just going to give an example from where I'm from because I haven't followed Washington politics, but I'm from Missouri. When I was growing up, which is long after the civil rights movement, in the 1980s, there was a liberal feminist named Harriet Woods who almost beat John Danforth in a Senate race in the mid-1980s at the height of the Reagan Revolution. And she, was a racial liberal. She was, a Jewish feminist from my city. And yet she didn't do that well in the urban areas of Missouri. She conquered not just like the rural areas in Missouri, but the kind of southern part of Missouri, sometimes called like Old Dixie. And so like, it's just a fact that the Democrats were competitive nationally in red states long after the civil rights era. And so it's not that that's not in play, but his question is very, reasonable. And there is something to say about realignment and the choices of Democrats to use the Supreme Court and the way it was used and the alienation that resulted. That's all like totally fair game. I just think that in the end, we can't stop there, and probably the much bigger factor is the alienation of working people from the Democratic Party. And that's about neoliberalism and the lack of hope. And so I stress that more, in part because if you posit endemic racism as the source of all of our ills, well, then what do we do? And it's just a fact that Donald Trump made inroads with the racialized working class and the non-white working class, especially Latinx working class in the last election. So it would be depressing if it turned out that America, for whatever historical reasons, is locked into illiberalism. I just don't think it can be true, because the Democrats were, like, as I said, long after the civil rights era, and for very good reason, competitive, amongst a lot of whites and not just non-whites. Yes.
Maybe this question is somewhat related to the one that was just asked, but I was interested by the comment you made in your talk about, Donald Trump being someone that was willing to say that it wasn't so great anymore, and
Sure.
you said that was appealing, and I'm interested in that comment because I feel like at the same time, a huge wing of the left had also been saying that, but just in a different way, very identitarian way, which is like all these
Yes.
people have been marginalized
Yes.
for so long. America's actually also
Yes.
always sucked,
Yes.
and it's never been great, and psych, like it's, and that's
Totally.
like,
yeah.
so why would one of those messages be more appealing than the other? And that kind of gets into an argument that Yasha Mount makes in his book Identity Politics, about how identitarian politics cannot be Marxist politics because it's not emancipatory. And so I'm just kind of curious about like what you.
I mean, I kind of agree with Yasha, but I just wouldn't go as far as he does in let's say exaggerating how much wokeness took over the left. I mean, of course, it took over certain parts of liberalism or progressivism, but I just think its effects have been exaggerated. And so that's kind of a boring empirical response, but I from what I can see, the reason why Trump was able to stand up there and say, America is not what we were told, is because in a sense he was saying that there was something in our history and traditions that was once letting people legitimately expect a bright future, just had been foreclosed. Obviously, if you go even further and say, there was nothing since 1619 worth having here, then I don't think you're going to get a lot of takers. Now, in fairness, that's not what the 1619 project said, but you might be right that some others said it. And that just strikes me as very different. But I think my main answer to this great question is it's more that like Donald Trump, in a way understood that people's life chances are mainly affected by like their economic situation. And he saw an immense opportunity when both parties had been neoliberal for such a long time to say, it's made your lives worse. Now, it's then hilarious that he went on to like embrace neoliberalism himself through the tax cuts and so forth. But I don't see the left, even when it kind of, the places where it was woke, really, kind of identifying the problem in as clear a way as Trump would manage to do. And that then is on the left, because in my view, it actually does have remedies to offer to the American carnage that has beset so many. It's just it hasn't had the chance, hasn't been able to build a big enough majority to implement it. Sir.
What would you say to the argument that I've seen here and there that the overwhelming development since the Second World War, but specifically after Reagan, with the help, as you say, of the neoliberal policies of both parties, the overwhelming concentration of wealth and economic power, which has given rise to this unaccountable social power that, well, it seems that we're in the age of oligarchs, and that the oligarchs have simply exploited very deftly the alienation of the people left behind, or those who fear they were left behind, to consolidate the political power of the oligarchs.
It's completely right. So I mean, that brings out kind of a facet of the story of our neoliberal period that's quite important. Now, what I'm, and there has been, increasing recognition since the publication of this French economist book, Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 20th Century, that we're living in an era of increasing economic hierarchy, and especially at the top end of the income distribution. The question is, like, what are the reasons that how are people responding to oligarchy? Because it does come in different forms. And people most recently, like when Bernie Sanders and AOC have been out there complaining about it, I think that was like a response to the Elon Musk moment of actually getting to operate government and imposing these draconian libertarian ideas on government. I have the sense that Americans tolerated some amount of class hierarchy, even at like the height of the 1950s, when America was allegedly great, at least white America. And it's not like Americans are necessarily against like making a buck, doing well for yourself. It's that it might be that the hierarchy has gotten so extreme, and that the oligarchs are like buying stuff with their newfound wealth. I think it's more that the ordinary person doesn't get enough of a piece to see his or her life, and especially his children's and grandchildren's life, is likely better. And so I agree with you totally that we need a new emphasis on shared prosperity. But it's not like, the class disparity is itself the problem. It's like, what happens to the belief systems of those in this, in a situation of increasing inequality that I think is driving Trumpism.
You made the offhand comment that liberalism 1.0, all those thinkers were empire builders.
Yes.
I'm wondering if we are to recapture liberalism 1.0, what are the contradictions that we need to like grapple with? If you could expand on that.
So look, I mean, I am like the most illiberal liberal, because I basically think that, you know, liberalism is very damaged goods for two main reasons. When we take into account that liberalism 1.0 drifted so far into laissez-faire, free, you know, economic freedom, and then is drifted back to neoliberalism in our time, it seems like there's a problem, which is it's not that Franklin Roosevelt is a total anomaly, but that we do need to explain, well, why does it keep drifting back to these libertarian ideas, and what would we need to do to inoculate it? And then on the kind of geopolitical side, it's just a fact that the main liberal powers, the United Kingdom in the 19th century and our country in the 20th, have been empires, and have done some good, but also horrendous bad. And it's again remarkable that Donald Trump was in position to say, look, we lose wars, and you know, we shouldn't fight them as often, except when I say so in Venezuela. But whatever. So I think it's a real problem, because liberals seem to drift towards imperialism. Mill like literally worked for the like, you know, the company like his father that was kind of like operating empire out in South Asia. And Tocqueville, whom I mentioned, was like a big apologist for France's Algerian campaign in 1830 and after. And I guess you again have to say, well, why the drift? How would we correct it? Liberals are cosmopolitans, meaning that they're basically saying that we should get to be free on a universal basis. And so you could imagine why you would then think, well, we can't just abandon the rest of humanity just because we have set up liberal institutions in one place. So they come by their imperialist temptation, let's say, you know, naturally or honestly. And then the question would be, what can be done to rescue liberalism from this imperialist temptation? Now, of course, if we had like some better non-imperialist politics that we could just sub in for liberalism, maybe it would make sense, but it doesn't seem like we do. Like, empire is the default political form of world history. So it's actually very difficult to figure out, how do we get beyond it? What does it mean to have a cosmopolitan liberal world? We barely worked on this problem. So it's a huge ask you're making, but it's a legitimate one. But if liberalism dies, you know, where it was invented, then we're not even on that problem.
So unfortunately, I'm going to have to cut off the conversation, so our time is up. Before we thank our guests, let me remind you again, next week on Wednesday, we have Emily Parker from Rutgers. She'll be talking about the politics of healthcare. And then on December 3rd, and it's at 4 o'clock, actually, not the noon hour. On December 3rd, we have Michael McFall coming, so join us for those events. But now, join me in thanking Sam Moyn for a really interesting conversation.